This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. In this week's episode, we'll look at political choices that can be viewed as controversial. Minority voters have agreed on one thing since the days of FDR. In presidential elections, they vote for Democrats. But what about those who turn against that tide? What are they hoping for, and how do they get there? Harvard University Kennedy School of Government professor Leah Rigueur explores the African American community's approach in The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics, and the Pursuit of Power. And then, one of the major political choices we make is about the question of choice. But The Nation columnist Katha Pollitt has some words for those who think they're advocates for choice in Reclaiming Abortion Rights. But first, here's my interview with Leah Rigueur. So, The Loneliness of the Black Republican, this is a memoir? Is it?
Not exactly. I am not a Republican, so going into this, I had no agenda, but I was really interested in the stories of Republicans and the Republican Party. And since I didn't know too much about it, I thought I'd do some exploring and found a lot of interesting stories.
And you explore the period of what it meant to be a Black Republican in the mid-20th century, which a lot of people can empathize with the idea that, hey, it made sense to be a Republican in the 1920s and the 1930s, going from that Party of Lincoln legacy. But what you're exploring is really what happens when that legacy wears off and we're actually dealing with 50, 60, 70 years later, real politics and real political questions.
So what are the changes that happen once the Republican Party starts moving in a different direction? What happens to African Americans? So what happens to that loyal constituency that were always Republican? And how do those changes happen? So really my book does explore this 50-year history, how these changes happen, what they look like, and what are the implications for politics and policy.
The Democrats were really the racist party of the time, to the degree that there were elected officials openly advocating explicitly segregationist and racist policies. It was Democrats in the South, right?
Right, so Southern Democrats play a huge role here. And I think what's important to note is that when Southern Democrats break off from the party, Dixiecrat Party, big year 1948, it's also an opportunity for a president like Truman to desegregate the armed forces and include civil rights in the Democratic Party platform, which really makes an impact for African American voters. Because what you have now happening, what you have in that moment, is African Americans being able to say, I can associate myself with the Democratic Party because Southern Democrats have formed their own party. So that's really important.
But it says something fascinating about the Republican Party at the time, too, in that there was just a stubbornness around dealing with, or perhaps just, you could say it's an ideological loyalty to a certain economic attitude, because they weren't the party that had people advocating, for the most part, segregation or enforcing segregation in the South. They were, for the most part, a party of folks who just had a specific view of economics that just didn't align with getting people jobs.
The interesting thing about this, though, is that even as the Republican Party is really wrestling with this individualism and fiscal conservatism, right, which are still hallmarks of the Republican Party today, they're also wrestling with this issue of race. Even as far back as 1932, 1936, they're saying, well, yes, we can include civil rights in our party platform, but we also don't want to alienate white voters. So will civil rights alienate white voters? And they kind of go out on a limb and try and appeal to both white voters and African Americans, but then begin increasingly pulling back in some respects for African American voters, fearing that they've lost them forever.
And now, Katha Pollitt